Priscilla was in a dilemma. Though her natural instinct was to reveal nothing, she was dependent upon CURRIE to see Elvis. Not only was CURRIE her transportation, he controlled her access. And it says in the chapter, her relationship with Elvis was also kept under wraps because it was outside the bounds of conventional morality, especially in the military world that the Beaulieu's inhabited. It was an unwritten rule, according to Priscilla's classmate, Mary Ann Barks, that high school girls did not date GIs. Any girl who dated a GI was considered trash. She can convey now, as she likes to do, Priscilla, in the narrative that she's had over these decades, that her parents were very strict, that they didn't want anything to do with this. They didn't like the fact that he was a rock and roll singer. It was just all supposedly such a bad influence. Well, if that's the case, it doesn't really stand to reason then why she was allowed to return to Elvis's home and why she was allowed to return over and over and over again. Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. I'm Jennifer. I'm so happy to have you back. It's time for episode 11 of Child Bride by Suzanne Finstad, the untold story of Pricilla Presley. I'm going to link all of the episodes in this playlist underneath this video. If you have not watched, at the very least, the last 3 episodes in this series, and you don't really know much about Pricilla Presley, her origin story, how she met Elvis, you need to go back and listen to those episodes. There's so much going on and there's so many conflicting narratives going on. And what the author, Suzanne Finstad, has been doing for the last 10 chapters is really poke numerous bullet holes in Pricilla Presley's ongoing narrative that she's held for the last 5 decades. Namely, she was a 14-year-old innocent when she met Elvis Presley and remained chaste until her wedding to him in 1967. So much happening. So last episode, she met Elvis finally in Wiesbaden, Germany, and the circumstances surrounding that fateful meeting are fraught with turmoil. There's a man in the narrative, his name is CURRIE Grant, and I've had a lot of you guys in the comments like, Cary Grant? What are you talking about? Not Cary Grant the actor, CURRIE Grant, C-U-R-R-I-E. This is a man that Priscilla met before she met Elvis, and this is the man, CURRIE Grant, that infamously brought Priscilla to Elvis for a first meeting. But the source of contention, the long-standing, decades-long feud between the two, is what was the nature of their relationship before Priscilla met Elvis. CURRIE contends and has maintained all these many years that he was intimate with Priscilla and used Priscilla to get what he wanted out of her before he took her to meet Elvis. Of course, this does not align with Priscilla's narrative. She has hotly contested this, sued the man for defamation. I go into all of that in previous episodes, so I want you to get caught up on all of that. And we'll talk a little bit more about Priscilla's defamation lawsuit against CURRIE Grant. She sued him for defamation after an explosive argument between her and CURRIE at the author of Child Bride, Suzanne Finstad's home in 1996. And Priscilla successfully won that defamation lawsuit, but there's so many layers. I have a whole video where I talk about it. I'll link that down below. We'll talk a little bit more about that defamation lawsuit at the end of chapter 12. That's coming. And in my research, I haven't found anything online about CURRIE to this day that says he's deceased. I believe he's still living. Now, if I remember correctly, CURRIE Grant, he was born in 1932, and I haven't seen anything online that says that the man has passed. So he's been around. He's a much older man. And at the time Suzanne released this book, the author, in 1997, CURRIE was in his mid-60s or so. So he's had quite a bit of time since this book when it came out, but per the instructions regarding the confidential agreement after Priscilla won that defamation lawsuit, he's no longer allowed to speak of her publicly. But mind you, neither is Priscilla. So we'll talk a little bit more about that defamation lawsuit at the end of chapter 12, the next episode. In the meantime, if you want to learn more about the dynamics of that, you can go ahead and check out the video. That's where we are. She has met Elvis. By all accounts, by all the people that Suzanne Finstad has interviewed, for this book who were around during the time that Elvis was stationed in Germany, who knew Elvis and was hanging out with him at his house off base during the time when Priscilla was being shuttled back and forth from Wiesbaden to meet him on school nights, they all said he was just like a love-struck teenager. He flipped out over her, was just completely enamored and infatuated with Priscilla. So that's where we were in the last episode. They met for the first time, and the relationship was literally on a fast-track roller coaster from the very, very beginning. Again, I've told you guys before, I'm not reading the book word for word here on my channel. I don't want to run into any problems. Reading books word for word on YouTube is a very dangerous business. These are recaps. Of course, I will read some juicy excerpts for you from the chapter as we go along, but this word for word business, I had to take down all of my Joan Crawford videos, and I had to take down all of my Errol Flynn videos. It was just a whole mess, a whole debacle. I'm just not even going to go there. So let's get started with chapter 11. So we start off this chapter, Suzanne, the author, is telling us that there really wasn't any indication from Priscilla to Suzanne in the interviews conducted with Priscilla that Priscilla thought that she would even see Elvis again after their first fateful meeting when CURRIE drove her to Bad Nauheim, Germany, because he was living in a home off base. She was kind of like taken aback and, by all accounts, not as really in awe of Elvis as Elvis seemed to be in awe of her. She had even said to the author, CURRIE had introduced me to him, Elvis, and that's all I ever thought it was. And after that fateful night, she just kind of put it out of her mind. And I read that and I was like, sure you did. Sure you did. I'm sure you put it completely out of your mind, especially given the fact that in the author's research, she's asserted over and over and over and over in talking to Priscilla's friends from when she was young, certain family members that she was close to, that her and her mother were ginormous Elvis fans. So I really doubt, and so does the author, that she met the biggest star in the universe at that time in 1959, that she just met him and then thought, well, I guess I'll never see this guy again, and just put it out of her head. I was like, yeah, right. No. So I don't buy that one bit. So the second time that she is brought to meet Elvis, CURRIE Grant is driving her. The first time he was in the car with his wife, Carol Grant, and CURRIE and both Carol were basically schooling Priscilla, trying to tell her, calm down, act cool, act demure, don't ask too many questions. I go into all that in the last chapter because they were basically trying to prep her, because at that point, Elvis had met quite a few women, around 13 to 15 or so, that were brought to the house he was living in off the base. And some he was really, really put off of. And usually those were the type of girls that were asking too many questions, that were fangirling over him. He just wanted no part of it. So CURRIE was basically setting Priscilla up, saying, just play it cool, girlfriend. Play it cool. You let him take the lead. Don't be pushy, essentially. And both CURRIE and his wife Carol, in their subsequent interviews with Suzanne, are both saying that, Priscilla was like a chatty Cathy doll in the car, chewing bubblegum, peppering them with questions, overly excited, super nervous. But then as soon as they would get to the house, and as soon as they would walk up to the door and get into the house and, be with Elvis and the friends that were there with him, she just had completely changed her entire persona. She was quiet. She was almost coquettish in her demeanor. And both CURRIE and Carol were like, who is this girl? Wow. Like, the transformation, the mature transformation that occurred right before their eyes was mind-boggling to them, basically. And according to CURRIE Grant, on that second car ride when he was driving her to Bad Nauheim to go meet Elvis, she was very, very fixated on, does he like me? Does he like me? Priscilla kept asking him questions over and over, like, you sure he likes me? And CURRIE was basically telling her, yes, he liked you. He definitely liked you because he wanted to spend alone time with you in his bedroom. And that's what everyone who was interviewed, except Priscilla, about that first night says happened, that Elvis did take Priscilla to his bedroom for intimate alone time with her. Priscilla, in her own narrative in Elvis and Me, says, no, that did not happen. It was the second time. But this is what Priscilla allegedly told CURRIE, and now this is what CURRIE is telling Suzanne, the author. Another really important thing to point out about this time frame was that CURRIE was essentially in charge of when Priscilla would go meet Elvis. Now, after the first few times when Priscilla left and CURRIE went to take her home, Elvis would always say to CURRIE, bring her back, CURRIE, bring her back, but he would never really say when he wanted to see her. So that's the impression that CURRIE's given the author Suzanne, is that, I was basically in charge of when I took her and when I didn't take her to go see Elvis. And in the book, it says, the call to return came not from Elvis, but from CURRIE. Elvis had not mentioned Priscilla to CURRIE since his request that first night to CURRIE to say, bring her back for me. So whether she would see her idol a second time turned on CURRIE's caprice. And CURRIE, he says that he would generally go off base to meet Elvis and his friends, sometimes go alone, sometimes take his wife several times a week, and just kind of hang out and pal around with Elvis and Elvis's buddies that were there at the house with him. And CURRIE even says, I was doing this essentially as a favor to my friend Elvis, but I didn't know that it was going to turn into what it turned into. He wasn't aware that Elvis was that over the moon for Priscilla. And CURRIE also describes to him the interesting phenomena of the fact that Priscilla's parents, Anne and Paul Beaulieu, did not seem too concerned about the fact that she was going more and more and more to meet this superstar idol off of base who was 10 years older than her. And the book says that he would call the house to ask, and Anne Beaulieu didn't hesitate. Anne got on the phone and said, it's okay, CURRIE, just what time do you want me to have her ready? That was basically her only thing that she would ever say. Okay, cool, she can come. What time are you going to pick her up? And it says that CURRIE was pretty much stunned by how nonchalant the parents seemed to be about this whole thing. And he says, quote, I thought, lady, it's like giving your daughter to the wolves. I don't leave my 14-year-old daughter with some guy I don't know. She's doing it because he's famous. And I would never have done that to my kid. Never, end quote. And it is true. I said in the last episode, there would be no way in holy hell that my daughter would be in that position. But as we've discussed in previous chapters, especially when Priscilla was younger and living in Texas when Elvis first exploded onto the scene in 1956, her and her mother were both mega fans. Which is something that Priscilla contests to this day. In her first book, Elvis and Me, she makes it very, very clear she liked him, but she was not a mega fan by any means. And that contention of Priscilla's is going to come into even sharper focus as we move deeper into the next two chapters. So pretty much same thing as last time. CURRIE brings Priscilla to the house a second time. Elvis gets a glimpse of her and just shoots up out of his seat like a rocket. He's just so excited to see her. Everyone around is like, what is going on? They've never seen Elvis act like this. And it's funny because at this point in the chapter, the author shows how meticulous and just like type A she is in her research, because she's talking about a gym teacher that Priscilla had in Wiesbaden on the base at her high school by the name of Geraldine Hopper. I'm like, wow, Suzanne is on point, okay? And Geraldine Hopper, in talking to Suzanne, is saying, I can understand why Elvis probably at that point in his life was so drawn to Priscilla, because not only was she gorgeous, but she just embodied all of the qualities that was so attractive to so many Southern men of his generation, innocence, purity. And she had to be a stark contrast to a lot of the types that Elvis had been encountering since he rocketed to superstardom, for the 3 years prior to that, because he was in Hollywood by that time. He was around a lot of fast talking Hollywood types, a lot of fast, loose women, so to speak. And I'm sure he was, having his fun too. He wasn't a whole innocent there, but it's like he was seeing that. So in sharp contrast, here comes this 14-year-old girl who's got this beautiful porcelain doll-like face, who seems quiet, seems shy, seems demure, and also someone that just reminds him so much, is like the haunting memory of his co-star, his long-lost love, according to tons of people that knew Elvis, and also the woman herself, Deborah Paget. That's from episode 5. He fell in love with Deborah Paget, who was his co-star on Love Me Tender. And I said in the last video, go Google Deborah Paget, and you will see how eerily similar she is to Pricilla Presley. So there's a lot of people that Suzanne interviewed that said he saw Priscilla, but what he really saw was Deborah, and that it really explains, at least in the beginning, that just lightning bolt attraction that he felt for Priscilla. So, this gym teacher that Suzanne, the author, is talking about kind of, reinforces that, like, yeah, Priscilla was beautiful. And I'm sure she was everything that he was looking for at that moment in time. He had just lost his mother. He was overseas in Germany. He was lonely. He was troubled with all these worries. And here was this beautiful young girl, and she was so impressionable, and he could mold her and meld her to be his ideal woman. But what's also interesting as a little sidebar is the author says that, Currie's wife, Carol, she apparently didn't buy this act. And according to Currie and Carol's daughter, Karen says, quote, "My mother recalls her," meaning Priscilla, "being a prissy, assertive, you think she's innocent, but she's not kind of girl. And my mom is pretty perceptive." So that's coming from Carol and Currie's daughter, Karen. So that's very interesting. So the book goes on and it says by the second evening, it started to become a ritual. The two of them, Elvis and Priscilla, would just retreat to Elvis's room. They would talk for hours. They would listen to records. They would make out. It was just a ritual. And Priscilla says that he would always have the radio on. They would be listening to mostly kind of sad music, and he would just pour his heart out to her. And she was just aghast, because he was so emotionally intimate with her so very quickly. And she even says, "I was just taken aback. This was so weird to me. I was so young, and here he was pouring out his heart, these very adult problems." Anxiety about losing his mother, stress about that, stress and anxiety about his career, wondering, is the public going to forget me? Am I going to be this washed up has-been by the time I get out of the army and go back home? And he would just talk to her and talk to her and talk to her. And she just became this silent sounding board for him and became very, very important to him. And she even says in Elvis and Me that he basically says to her very early on, "You are going to be very important for me here because I can trust you. I'm all alone. I don't trust many people. Like, I really, really like you and trust you." So it was just this symbiotic relationship. She's a young girl. She's infatuated. He sees her as someone that he could protect, but also really open up and be himself with. And this is a quote from Priscilla to the author. She says, "I guess he trusted me," meaning Elvis. "He trusted me a lot and he was very close to me. The great thing about having Elvis at that time before he came back from the army was that he was so unaffected. He was still raw. He was still innocent." And she says she feels really fortunate that she had been part of his life during that time, that she was able to see that before real fame started to get a foothold in him. And then the author talks about Elvis's fascination with Priscilla's looks, how beautiful she was. And Priscilla was beautiful and still is at 81, a very beautiful woman. In my opinion, unfortunately, has just indulged a little bit too much in facial plastic surgery. That's just my opinion. But nevertheless, beautiful woman, especially when she was younger. And the author says that apparently Elvis would just study her face almost with the meticulousness of a plastic surgeon. And he was also starting to notice once he had met her parents, according to Priscilla, about the third or fourth date at the time, her dad, Paul Beaulieu, had put the law down saying that if you want to continue seeing him, we have to meet him. We must meet him. And in her book, she talks about the first meeting when Vernon, Elvis's dad, and Elvis go over to the Beaulieus, and Elvis is, of course, wanting to impress, wearing his army uniform. And that's when he first meets Paul and Anne, her parents. So after that, he's looking at Priscilla, always fascinated by how beautiful she is. And he starts asking more and more questions, saying like, "You don't look like anyone in your family. You definitely don't look like your mom. And you really don't look like your dad. What is going on here?" And Priscilla says that she didn't really say too much the first few nights and things that they were with each other. But then she said more and more as he would open up more and more, she felt that she was in a position to feel really comfortable to tell him. So she eventually does tell him that Paul Beaulieu is not her real father, that she had just found out a year before this decade-long secret that her mother and her stepfather had been keeping from her about the identity of her real father, because up to that point she thought that Paul was her dad. Wasn't her dad. Her dad was a pilot named James Wagner, and I go into all that in early chapters. So she's showing Elvis a picture of her father. He's just overwhelmed, according to the author, just overwhelmed with this primal need almost to step in and protect Priscilla, because he was vulnerable too at that point, having lost his beloved mother Gladys. So now knowing that Priscilla had suffered this loss, he became even more fiercely protective of her. And Pricilla told Suzanne, the author, she said, it was one of those evenings that we shared. We did a lot of talking. We were sharing losses. And she finally told Elvis who her real father was and showed him a picture. She told Suzanne that she was carrying a lot of guilt about revealing that to Elvis, and that she subsequently went to her mother and admitted, I told Elvis that Dad isn't my real dad. And she was carrying this guilt. And she said she wasn't sure how her mom was going to handle it, but apparently the mom was okay with it. And the author is saying, well, there's another example of Priscilla carrying all the emotional baggage and trauma from her mother and stepfather's decision to keep that from her for a decade. And I've said that throughout this entire series, that I really do think that that was the pivotal emotional trauma in Priscilla's life, to find out that your parents kept that big of a secret from you, the identity of a father. According to the author John Bradshaw, he said that that is right up there in the hierarchy of family secrets, second only to incest. That's how emotionally devastating it is when you find out that the identity of one of your parents, that it's not who you think it was. So there was a lot going on there. And you find out in the book, in the earlier chapters, that after she finds out about that, a lot of her friends at the time said that there was a marked difference in her. She started running with a more wild crowd. She started, according to these girlfriends, acting promiscuous, running around with boys that, the type of boys that no good girl would want to be seen with. So I really do think that it did affect her, and it affected her negatively. And moreover, the biggest thing it taught her was that secrets are the end all be all. You have to be a keeper of secrets, and you can't really trust anyone. That basically you have to take over the reins emotionally in your life, that you cannot trust anyone, and you can't believe that they have your best interests at heart and that they're going to step in and help you along the way. You have to remain self-sufficient, and you have to be determined to look out for yourself. And I would argue that's basically how Priscilla has lived her life. Guarded, secret. She's an enigma wrapped in a riddle, right? And she's very determined. And a lot of people argue very, very controlling. All goes back to that early trauma. That's my opinion. The author writes, the revelation, meaning when Elvis found out about what happened to Priscilla and who Priscilla's real father was, it said it stirred something within Elvis. He was by nature a tender, compassionate man, and Priscilla's secret and the loss of her real father fostered in him a strong, almost primal desire to shield her. In a complicated way, Pricilla transferred her emotional dependence to Elvis, who assumed the mantle of Jimmy Wagner, her fantasy father figure, guardian angel, and protector. And Pricilla says, he had a lot of empathy for me, after especially when she told him about the traumatic discovery of finding out who her real father was. And Priscilla's basically saying that when you shared a loss with Elvis, it just fostered that protectiveness in him. In exchange, Pricilla filled an enormous void for Elvis, listening to him for hours as he reminisced about Gladys, that was his mother, talking with him in the private language he and his mother had invented. Priscilla's physical resemblance to Deborah Paget reinforced their intimacy. It was an intricate, complicated, psychosexual relationship, almost beyond fathoming to anyone but Pricilla and Elvis. And the author even interviewed Joe Esposito, one of the most famous members of Elvis's Memphis Mafia and his right-hand man. Elvis had met Joe during his time in the army, and Joe Esposito said, quote, but he looked at Priscilla in the way because she had that look. I feel that had a lot to do with it. He's talking about how he feels that a young Priscilla not only looked like a young Deborah Paget, but also looked a lot like a young Gladys Presley. And that was a huge part of the attraction, because Elvis wanted to be around people that he loved, that looked familiar to him. And Priscilla just brought all that out in him. And he said that he just wanted her to be in his life. She was pure, she was innocent, and she reminded him of his own innocence and a time that he was desperately trying to get back. His comfortable childhood when everything was right with the world and he was with his mother and he had her in his life. And he says that he feels it was a really symbiotic relationship, that, you know, Elvis wanted to take care of Priscilla and Priscilla kind of took care of him, and that's what brought them together. So the second night ends. Elvis brings Priscilla down the stairs at 12:45, which at that point is already 45 minutes past her curfew, because that was basically the only thing that Paul Beaulieu had told CURRIE when he took Priscilla the first night was bring her back by midnight. And CURRIE's like, okay. But so at that point, CURRIE is saying, I didn't really feel anxious or apprehensive about her being late the second night, because just based on the way her parents were when he brought her back the first night, it was almost like they didn't care. So this is where the chapter starts getting a little bit dark. And so I mentioned before that on that second ride, Carol, who is CURRIE's wife, wasn't with them in the car. It was just CURRIE and it was just Priscilla. So at this point, CURRIE, who allegedly by his accounts had already been intimate with Priscilla at that point, because according to CURRIE, allegedly that is the price that Priscilla made for entry into Elvis's world. According to him, she had that intimacy with CURRIE. There's been some debate in earlier chapters. Suzanne, the author, has wondered if indeed her time with CURRIE, if it happened, was at her first time, because again, there was a wild crowd, according to her schoolmates, that she was running with. We don't know, but that is just what CURRIE believes, that he is the one that took her first time. So he's just being gross, and on the ride home, just pumping her for information and trying to say, like, don't be coy, don't try to play the part here, because I know who you are. I know what you're about. I've spent time with you. I've been with you. Who cares? Just tell me, what's going on upstairs in the bedroom when it's just you and Elvis. So he's just pumping her for information. And he's trying to phrase it as, you're my friend, he's my friend, what's the big deal? And I'm just reading this and I'm like, oh my gosh, this is just such disgusting predatory behavior. I mean, and then to try to explain away, like, to her, to basically disarm her and make her feel like it's no big deal, even though it is a huge deal. I mean, you're talking about intimate things that are completely inappropriate. It's so gross all around. So the author says, Priscilla was in a dilemma. Though her natural instinct was to reveal nothing, she was dependent upon CURRIE to see Elvis. Not only was CURRIE her transportation, he controlled her access. She visited Bad Nauheim at his discretion, for Elvis had not requested she return on a particular date, nor had he called Priscilla formally for a date. So she's feeling a little bit trapped and cornered, like, I guess I should appease this guy and tell him what's going on between Elvis and I. And even the author is acknowledging that this whole dynamic is just basically sick. And okay, guys, I'm just going to say, as we go further into the next few chapters, if there are certain words that it looks like I'm mouthing, I'm doing it on purpose. YouTube doesn't like certain words, so I am going to mouth some words. You get the gist. Okay, we're all adults here, but it's just something you have to do for YouTube. But the author even acknowledges that this dynamic between a 14-year-old Priscilla and a then 27-year-old CURRIE Grant at the time was really gross and sick. And she says, for Priscilla, CURRIE Grant occupied the unusual triad of mentor, father confessor, and keys to the kingdom of Elvis. So yeah, pretty gross. So then CURRIE is saying that Priscilla, okay, she realizes that she's in sort of a pickle, that she's going to have to open up and she's going to have to tell CURRIE some of the details about what's going on. And she just says that, they did a lot of talking, they do a lot of kissing. And she says by the second time, Elvis had her bra and her blouse off and she was laying on his bed and they were making out, essentially. And it goes on to say that she was basically torn because of the fact that not only is CURRIE her gateway to Elvis at the time, but she's probably feeling really insecure in of herself. Here she is, this 14-year-old girl with this 24-year-old international superstar, and she doesn't really know how to handle herself. So that's part of the reason too why she would open up to CURRIE and answer all of his gross questions. But I've said this before too. I mean, unfortunately, this did happen. It was the complete and total of a child. There's nothing else that can be said in this instance, and in both instances with both Elvis and CURRIE. I mean, she was a 14-year-old girl, and what was going on was absolutely not okay. CURRIE seems to have a lot more nefarious and deep and dark intentions toward Priscilla, and just exploitive way that he looks at her. Not that Elvis was in the right for what he was doing, but he definitely seemed to be more of a protective figure. But we've talked about this. We all know that this is just particularly disturbing material and a scenario that's going on here. But CURRIE told the author that he brings her home the second time and it's almost 2 a.m. And the parents were just like, all smiles, thanks, CURRIE. And he's like, I can't believe these parents. What is going on with these parents? And of course he's thinking that because he knows, if his account is true, what he's done and how he's mistreated a 14-year-old girl. And at this point in the chapter, the author starts pointing out to us the steely reserve that Pricilla Presley, even at a young, impressionable age of 14, seems to possess. And she says, extraordinarily, Priscilla told almost no one about her dates with Elvis Presley. Her tendency to draw an imaginary line between herself and others, that aura of mystery she possessed, even as a child, quote, got worse after I met Elvis, end quote. That's what Priscilla said. And Priscilla goes on, where most girls would probably exploit it and would probably be giddy, she protected it passionately. And she says, I don't know why I was so protective of it. And the author says that Priscilla had been trained by her mother to withhold the truth, to keep what was real a secret, sacred, and untouchable. And then the author's even saying that she talked to a friend of Priscilla's during her early time in Germany, a boy by the name of Robbie Jones. And even Robbie Jones told the author that at that time, she was extremely, extremely guarded. And a couple times he did go over to her house, that he had so much respect for the fact that she never really brought up Elvis at all. And she didn't talk about him at all. That if he asked her a question, she would just answer it quickly, pretty much and succinctly, but then just drop it. And again, that's where that symbiotic relationship between Priscilla and Elvis comes in, because it's like they're kind of just protecting and insulating each other. He's just taken over her life now as being this father figure, this protector, and then she's this soundboard, this little girl that he can take care of. So that's how this bond between the two of them is nurtured and is growing and growing. And Priscilla says to the author, quote, I think I was protecting him because I would never betray him. He confided a lot to me that I would never share with a girlfriend that I might never see again. So think about that. That's a very adult, mature way to think about things, that, don't betray people. And I mean, it's a good thing. You don't betray people. You don't go broadcasting confidences that important people in your life have shared to you. But that's usually an adult thing. I mean, a lot of times, especially a 14-year-old girl meeting a superstar, you would have thought that she would have been more giddy and more catty and more flippant and trying to use that as leverage with her girlfriends and kids at school to kind of gain popularity or whatever, but she didn't do that. So all very telling in the enigma wrapped in a riddle. It's my favorite thing to say about her, but it's true. That is Priscilla. But then the author reminds us too that another big component to the secrecy surrounding all of it, and the reason why Priscilla and her parents were so tight-lipped about the fact that she was spending so much time with him, was just because it was considered completely inappropriate, even by those standards back in 1959. And it says in the chapter, her relationship with Elvis was also kept under wraps because it was outside the bounds of conventional morality, especially in the military world that the Beaulieu's inhabited. It was an unwritten rule, according to Priscilla's classmate, Mary Ann Barks, that high school girls did not date GIs. Any girl who dated a GI was considered trash. And Priscilla had another friend named Debbie Ross that the author interviewed. And according to Debbie, she had said it wasn't proper to do that. She was telling the author that. And Debbie says, and particularly if you were an officer's daughter, that kind of mixing at the time was not approved, particularly since we were 14 years old. And Debbie even tells Suzanne that her parents didn't even want her mixing with Priscilla. She apparently lived across the hall from the Beaulieu's the following year, and that her parents didn't even want her spending too much time with Priscilla. And Debbie told Suzanne, quote, I remember my mother didn't particularly like Priscilla. I think she was concerned about someone my age dating or seeing a man 10 years older than we were. I think she thought there must be something more to it, or there must be something about it that I didn't need to be a part of. Very telling. And the author at this point in the chapter says, yeah, despite all of the moral conventions of the day, that this still didn't seem to affect Anne or Paul's idea about whether or not it was a good idea to continue have Priscilla seeing Elvis. And CURRIE told the author that, yeah, like every single visit, it wasn't, should she be going, or I don't know. It was, yeah, what time do I have Priscilla ready? When do you want to pick her up? And CURRIE says, quote, the first 4 to 6 weeks I was taking her up there, it was always my call, meaning driving her up to Bad Nauheim to visit Elvis at his house. And the author says, Priscilla strove to appear older than her 14 years, an assignment her mother helped her carry out. Anne, who had snuck out of her parents' house in her mother's high heels to date Priscilla's father, loaned her clothes to Priscilla to help create an illusion of sophistication far beyond that of a 9th grader. And she was assisting her with her hair and her makeup, just creating that more mature illusion. And there was another classmate that the author interviewed by the name of Donna Paulin, and she said that she always remembers Priscilla in foxy clothes, multiple billowing skirts with these petticoats underneath that would really emphasize her tiny waist. So there was definitely an image that Anne was trying to portray there. What do you guys think about all of this? What do you think about Priscilla's parents and their eagerness to have Priscilla get going with this relationship with Elvis? It all really seems to me, obviously, that if her parents had taken a different stance, none of this would have happened. They obviously had to have no problem with it. She can convey now, as she likes to do, Priscilla, in the narrative that she's had over these decades, that her parents were very strict, that they didn't want anything to do with this. They didn't like the fact that he was a rock and roll singer. Her mother didn't even really care for the fact that he was a rock and roll singer. It was just all supposedly such a bad influence. Well, if that's the case, it doesn't really stand to reason then why she was allowed to return to Elvis's home and why she was allowed to return over and over and over again, especially on school nights. So all very interesting, gets you thinking a little bit. She was a 14-year-old girl. She was subject to the environment she was in. And in my opinion, the adults around her were not making good choices for her. The next chapter is going to be called A Question of Virginity. Now, this is a big one. This is where the author really starts to get serious and starts to really question Priscilla's stories and the narrative that she's been perpetuating over these decades. Because if you've built your legacy on the fact that you were not an Elvis fan, that you were a virgin on your wedding night, we all know why Priscilla would probably want to further and just try to do everything she can to solidify that narrative. She wants to preserve her reputation, her good name, and Elvis's as well. And it's pretty evident over the decades, especially considering the fact that Priscilla's tried to just reinforce this narrative over and over and over, that she probably felt that she stood to lose a lot if that narrative did get away from her and if more came out to provide evidence to the contrary. Personally, in this day and age, I don't really feel that it would have been as huge of a deal as what Priscilla has made out in her mind. You know, now at the age of 81, what if Priscilla did open up to us a little bit more and tell us more about what really happened? I'm right now in the middle of reading the book she released in the fall of 2025 called Softly As I Leave You. And so much of what I'm reading is very telling. You can really tell the not only generation that she's from, which in a lot of ways I think is great, because I think a lot of people now, especially young people under the age of 30, are way too big into the oversharing. It's gotten to the point where it's obnoxiously gross in what people share online about their private lives. So in a way, I do admire the fact that she's from a traditional generation that didn't go around blabbing everything all the time. But then again, she was giving interviews after her divorce from Elvis while he was still alive, starting to. Her first was, I believe, in the mid-70s, and she gave one to the Ladies' Home Journal. So little by little, culminating with her 1985 release of Elvis and Me, she has shared quite a bit. It's not like she's been completely private over the years. So if you are going to share, why don't you really share what really happened? In my opinion, not what you want us to believe happened. So it's just, it's a lot. And this is the chapter, like I said, chapter 12 coming up, where Suzanne really holds Priscilla's feet to the fire and is like, why is she doing this? Why is she perpetuating this? There's so much evidence to the contrary from so many sources that she's interviewing that say that this isn't what happened. Priscilla's timeline of events don't match up to the timelines of CURRIE Grant and a lot of other people that knew Elvis during these early years in Germany. So there's a lot going to be happening, a lot to discuss. That chapter is coming up. I can't wait for that one. I hope you join me, but thank you for joining me for this chapter. Again, let me know what you think about this one in the comments down below. Like the video, share the video, hype the video, get started on other episodes that you may have missed in the playlist, and I will talk to you guys very soon.